a big thing with my design philosophy. I don't want to just be like, Pokemon did it, so we're going to do it. I want to reinvent things as much as possible, but I also don't want to reinvent things for the sake of it. And I think types are really good for a critter game. They feel nice, they sort it well, and I even like the math. I really like the math behind Pokemon types. That being said, while I think it's cool to keep types, I want to reimagine how types work a little bit. And a big thing that a lot of fantasy games have, which is one of our inspirations, is that there are opposite types that are super effective against each other. So the reason we're doing 2 starters instead of 3 is because instead of a rock, paper, scissors with them, we're doing types that combat each other super effectively. So the 2 starters are martial and magic type. Magic type is super effective against martial, and martial is super effective against magic, representing that in tabletop RPGs, the weakness to big burly fighting guys is usually blast them with a spell. They don't have a good will save, they are going down, and the easy way to beat a spellcaster is beat the whoop out of them. So that's why martial and magic type are super effective against each other. So she is going to start with the opposite one from you. If you pick Rumblin', she's going to get Familiar. If you pick Familiar, she's going to get Rumblin'. Yeah, so light versus dark. And speaking of light versus dark, we are also having the sacred and profane types, which are similar and are super effective against each other. Actually, let's get into the base combat mechanics, because I have some interesting ideas there that I think really separate this from Pokemon in a cool way. They're going to make it feel like its own critter capture game in combat. So the thing that I'm keeping from Pokemon 100% no matter what, because I think it's the best part of Pokemon's design, is what I call choice in a cup games. So a choice in a cup game, in my opinion, means you load your choice at the same time as your opponent, both are revealed, and they play out in order of a speed tier instead of in order of you take a turn, I take a turn. I think people are really misunderstanding what's happening when they play Pokemon. It isn't I make a move, you make a move, we're taking turns. It's the turns happen simultaneously, we both pick our move at the same time, and both of us act at the same time with the order determined by speed. It's not really turn-based because the turns are always, every single time, simultaneous. And I think people don't understand that. And I think it's one of the coolest things about Pokemon's mechanics. That being said, we're going to do our best to communicate with the player that that's what's happening. It is going to always be double battles if it's summoner versus summoner. So let's explain what a summoner versus summoner battle looks like, okay? Each of you will send out 1 critter to what's called the front line and 1 critter to what's called the back line. We're going to grab all 4 of these. Actually, all 5 of these. Let's show you guys what this looks like, okay? Let's say on one side we have this summoner. On the other side, we have this other summoner. They are fighting each other. One of them has Rumblin', that's this little guy, and a Sorcerer. Let's say the other guy has this Joblin and a Familiar. Here's the way combat works. Each summoner summons their creatures. One of them goes to the back line, which they're probably going to choose the spellcasters, and each one has a front line. My critter got PTSD from always being sent to the front lines. Hey, these guys love the front lines. Look at them. They are ready for the front lines. So this represents the sides of the battle. You have 2 actions per turn, 1 for each of your critters. This makes sense, right? You could Curdy Dan. There's going to be counterplay to every strategy. A thing that I love about Pokemon's design that I think every game should try to emulate if you have a competitive scene at all. In Pokemon, every single strategy has at least 1 move or ability, usually a move and an ability, usually more than 1, that completely undoes that strategy. Literally completely annihilates that strategy. That's a thing I think you should always aim for in your design, that every strategy has a complete undo. So we have this in the front line, this in the back line. Each of them is going to pick their 2 moves secretly, 1 for each of their critters, right? The fastest critter here is going to probably be Joblin. Joblin is going to use its signature move, Spiked Chain. So Spiked Chain is a move that only works if you're on the front line. Joblin is currently on the front line and moves first. Spiked Chain can only target a guy in the back line. It targets Sorcerer. Spiked Chain deals a small amount of martial type damage, drags the opponent to the front line, and then grapples it. So now this has the grappled condition. The grappled condition means that until the grappled condition ends, you are trapped in place and can't move or be switched out. So Sorcerer is now locked in place. The grappled condition and all conditions and damage over time effects in this game have a countdown. This is a 2-turn grapple, which means it'll reduce by 1 at the end of the turn and reduce by 1 again the turn after. your damage over time abilities, if they're as weak as they are in Pokemon, aren't going to be used. So we need to make them more powerful. But if they're going to be more powerful, I need them to be limited or they're going to feel broken. Dragged up, small amount of damage, grappled. It lost some health. The next fastest initiative is Sorcerer. Sorcerer is using the move Magic Bolt, its signature attack that hits with 3 magic type cantrips and has limitless targeting. Limitless targeting basically means it can be fired from anywhere to anywhere. 3 magic bolts fly out. The target they chose was Goblin. If the creature is swapped out for a different creature, it still targets that slot. So 3 magic bolts come out, deal a pile of damage to him. The next fastest initiative is going to be our boy Rumblin. Rumblin is going to use Strike. Now let's talk about basic moves. When you go to use a move, you have some options. One is spells. Spells are things your summoner can do. So instead of command your creature, you could heal one of your little guys. You could try to capture something. Those are all your guys' moves. Think of them as items in Pokemon, basically. If you pick moves, you're going to have 4 options. So Spiked Chain was one of the 4 for Rumblin. Another one would be like Slam. Another one might be Chokehold. We haven't decided all the names yet. This is very early in design process, but basic moves are move. Move would be like just straight up walking to a different space, going from the front line to the back line or the back line to the front line. So if Rumblin here were to pick move, he would retreat to the back line. Probably not going to. He wants to be up front and making hits. Another basic move is either strike if your physical attack is higher, or cantrip. Cantrip is if your magical attack is higher. Strike is the equivalent in Pokemon of a 40 base power move. This is basically tackle. Cantrip is 20 base power. Why is the magical one weaker? Because Strike only works if you're both in melee, and Cantrip is limitless targeting. Physical creatures also get a second one called Throw. Throw is the equivalent in Pokemon of a 10 base power move that only works to target creatures that are 1 space away from you. So if you're in the back line, you can target the front line, and if you're in the front line, you can target the back line. It's very weak, and it has a special trait. The special trait is normally untyped moves like Strike and Cantrip change into the primary type of the user. So if Sorcerer uses Cantrip, it becomes Magic type. If Rumblin uses Strike, it becomes Martial type. Throw stays typeless and only changes type based off of the terrain, because you're yeeting a piece of the actual battlefield at your opponent. I think it's a cool way to come up with terrain strategies, and the reason these options are here is so that if the spacing is against you, if your creature's in the wrong zone because you've been pushed or anything, you still have an option. You are never without something you can do. Because when I was going through theory crafting about the game, a big issue that it would have is you'd end up in situations where you were truly hopeless. There was nothing you can do. You'd basically lost. I really want to avoid that. So Throw, Move, Strike, Cantrip are there so that your critter is never without an option. So let's move through the rest of the turn. He's using the basic move Strike. Now I want to talk a bit about how we're doing items. There's an extra little quirk of items that I want to use that I can't guarantee working yet, so I'm not going to talk about it. But I want items that change Strike, Cantrip, and Throw to be more interesting. So he's going to use Strike, but the item we gave him is called the Striking Sword. Let's call it that. It basically is going to be an item that it can only be equipped to creatures with a humanoid or goblinoid body type. Because he is a goblinoid body type, he can use the Striking Sword, and it changes Strike from 40 base power to an 80 base power martial move. He slams his sword into Goblin, and Goblin goes down. Any kind of move that change effect based off of where you are or how far your target could be really good. That's a thing that we're going to do a lot of. It's something... Oh, no accuracy. Narwhals, no accuracy in this game. I forgot to mention, I love uncertainty, but the uncertainty in this game comes from moving. If someone changes zone, you don't really know if you're going to be able to hit. So the way that we're doing accuracy is moves can only miss if they change zone. With having zone changing in the game already, having accuracy as well would feel like a real piss off. There might be a couple moves that can miss as like a special downside, but for the vast majority of the time, accuracy is not going to be in this game because the accuracy comes from the uncertainty of people moving their critters around. We finish the turn with the slowest critter, Familiar, who is going to use Let's just call it explosion. Explosion targets a zone instead of a critter. Familiar knew that the partner Goblin was going to use spiked chain to drag Sursiper up. So it targets the front line with an explosion and hits them both for a chunk of damage, and this little guy goes down. Then at the end of the turn, each of them replaces where their guy was standing with a new critter. That's the basic way combat's going to work. I think it gives a lot of options for it to feel fresh and unique, and I've done a lot of theory crafting so far of the issues with it. Early in testing, we're going to be programming a basic version of this as a simulator so that we can test it more, but these are the simple ideas. Will speed be a factor? Will moves be priority by typing? Speed is a factor, but we're calling the speed stat initiative because of ttrpg inspiration.